Welcome to the last couple of videos in the challenge. The videos will continue after the challenge, but uh, this is the next to the last one. And I apologize, but I'm running a little bit behind on some of the things that I wanted to get up uh, as resource links. I will have a resource link up on the topic for these last two uh, videos later today. I will put it as a link under either this one or the last one of the challenge that I'm going to make towards the end of the day. This is earlier in the day for me, not, pry your eyes up and have another cup of coffee early, but uh, earlier in the day than I usually get started. The topic that I wanted to discuss in these last two videos is philosophy. Now, don't let your eyes glaze. And don't think that it's going to be something dry that's going to put you to sleep. It's actually the first thing we need to talk about is what is philosophy? Well, technically, according to the Greek words that are its root, it's the love of wisdom. But that doesn't really tell you much. What does it mean to love wisdom? But actually, on a more practical level, philosophy is how you see the world. Your philosophy is how you see the world and how you make sense out of it. How you figure out how things work, and then apply that knowledge either in your, yeah, I can almost talk. Excuse me. Either in terms of how you set up and live your daily life, or how you apply it to problems you're trying to solve. One of the easiest examples in our society is science, technology. How do you think we got all these technologies? It has to do with how they see the world and how they see it, how they expect it to work based on how they see it. And it's the same thing in a personal philosophy. Now, there are a lot of different philosophers. A lot of people have, personal views of the world. There are some that are more general, some that are more they're easier to grasp and apply, say for the average person, or for anybody. Now, based on your personal likes and dislikes and your character, who you are, some philosophies will appeal more to you than others. However, the important thing is the practical part of that philosophy, is the how do you use it to make sense of the world. And it has to do with a lot with the assumptions that you make about how the world works, because based on how you assume it works and how you've observed that it works, then you have certain expectations about your actions. Our basic philosophy these days, its foundations are the concept of cause and effect. Everything has a cause and it produces an effect. If you put a lot of energy into something and there's no effect, well, then that probably means, in our way of looking at things anyway, that you didn't really understand how it worked, or that there was something you didn't take into account that knocked it off the rails. And that's one of the reasons why philosophy is useful, because it gives you a systematic overall view of how to make sense of the world, and then what to expect based on which avenues you choose to set causes in motion. Now, in our society, the best example of that, the easiest, most accessible, is physics. We live in a in a society that's dominated by the worldview of scientific materialism. Now, one of the things that means is that there is assumed to be a physical cause for everything. There are other philosophies that look at those physical causes as immediate causes, things that have been developing through other levels before they get to the point where, bang, there's an event, there's an effect. And so one of the most blatant and obvious examples of our philosophy is that we assume that if you apply a certain amount of force, it creates a certain effect. That applies to, for instance, internal combustion engines, the pistons moving, turning the axles that move your wheels, that make your car run. It applies to just about everything that is a that has to do with the application of a material force to cause a material effect. And we even have carried this over into our understandings of things like medicine and psychology and things like that. They're also in that in that same worldview at this point, and that's that. Well, there's take for example the idea from psychology that everything that's going on with you now are the results of experiences that you had when you were much younger, like for instance as a child. That's also the same cause and effect model. Now, some schools of psychology have taken that even further down to the point where it's become what's known as psychiatry, and that's that, well, it really doesn't make sense to them in terms of their view of the world, the assumptions they make about how it works, to go back to something less tangible, like the emotional reaction to an experience, or the emotional holdover of events that occurred when you were, say, for instance, a child. They like to look at things in terms of biochemistry. So if you go to a psychiatrist, he would look at your issue and say, oh, well, that's an imbalance of these chemicals in your bloodstream, and when it hits your brain, it makes this happen. Well, he doesn't really know that in detail. He knows that from basically statistical studies. Statistical studies in some ways are wonderful. I mean, I'm pretty well versed in statistics myself, but statistics deals with groups of people, not individuals. And many times there are individual factors that would make the diagnosis very different, would make the way to remedy a psychological or physical issue very different than what is usually considered to be the best approach by conventional medicine. Now, whether that's psychological or physical, doesn't matter. They're both coming from the same worldview, the same philosophy. I mean, of course, I am greatly affected by that same philosophy. I live in the same society, the same world that you do. I mean, my head may be in different places occasionally, but, hey, we're all here together. We're all trying to bail water out of this boat and row it towards our destination. And it helps to have a grasp of, what really is the way that the world is seen. How do we make sense out of it, and then how do we apply that understanding to making it better, or at least accomplishing what we want to accomplish in it. Now, there are the roots of the whole idea of philosophy goes back to the ancient Greeks, and they had a philosophy that's rather different than ours, but the point at which there's agreement, where they meet, where they run in parallel lines, is that they both prize logic, prize rationality. For instance, the Greeks held, you know, being rational to be a very, you know, a very high virtue. We sometimes wonder in our society if it's still held in quite as high esteem. A lot of people seem to be swayed by and react to more emotional triggers. As far as our worldview is concerned, and as far as the philosophy that the advertisers and promoters and you know, political campaign managers are using, they're looking at cause and effect in terms of, oh, well, you know, what emotional buttons do we push to get the response that we want? What appeals do we make? Very rarely are these appeals particularly rational, and very rarely do they speak very much about causes leading up to the event or issue that they want you to react to. Of course, they want it. There's a whole science of this stuff, and the science of manipulating opinions actually began historically, as far as we can tell. I mean, of course, people did this. People have done this forever in one way or another, but the form that we're most familiar with developed probably during the First World War and is attributed to the British. However, they never did a lot with it. They used it somewhat during the war, mostly to present the Germans as beasts, and to mobilize more support for the Western powers' efforts to defeat them in that First World War. However, later we started to get a little more diversity in the opinions of people who were studying psychology. I mean, beyond Freud, he was sort of the grandfather of modern psychology, you might say. And people have branched off from him, but taken somewhat different tacks. But the picture that remains, both in popular consciousness and in turn, and seems to have become rather embedded in the philosophy of that underlies our society, is basically the Freudian picture, that you're conditioned by these events that occurred in your youth. Now, there's a little extension to that in that there's, better living through chemistry. And there's the school of thought developed by a psychologist named B.F. Skinner, who and Ivan Pavlov, and they both basically said, human beings are animals. You can condition responses. The same way you train a dog, you can train a person. And they did experiments that pretty much verified that. Of course, it didn't work in every case, and there are certain limits, depending on what society you're in at the time. There are certain limits as to how far they could push that. One of my favorite jokes for people who know about Pavlov, Pavlov did these experiments where he would make a dog salivate or bark or whatever response he was looking for. He trained them to do that in response to ringing a bell. And one of it's not a great joke, but it's not bad. It's the story goes, Pavlov is taking a break. He's at the bar. He's having a beer, and the phone rings, and he says, "My God, I forgot to feed the dog." Who conditioned you? But anyway, Not everybody will think that that's a wonderful joke, but it makes the point that according to our worldview, people can be conditioned, animals can be conditioned. It's any biological system that's has reached a certain degree of awareness, and even some that aren't very aware, can be conditioned to respond. And that's an application of that philosophy of, well, you apply a force, there's a result. And that force, you know, we have to understand that force. That force has to be either, you know, a physical force, like, say, gravity, or the firing of an internal combustion engine, or the firing of the propellant behind a bullet if you're going to shoot a gun. But they're all physical forces. And as far as non-physical forces are concerned, well, some scientists will say that non-physical forces are beyond or outside of the concerns of science, and that until and unless they can be linked to physical forces, or physical forces that we didn't know about before can be discovered to explain them, then they're, you know, mere superstition and, you know, opinion. Well, in some cases, that's entirely true. But the thing is, it kind of puts blinders on you. It kind of limits your view, and then as far as evidence for anything is concerned, that evidence from a scientific materialist point of view, that evidence needs to be statistical. It needs to be linked back to controlled experiments. Well, there are things that are really not amenable to the controlled experiment approach. One of them is medical studies and psychological studies. It's very, I mean, when you take the patient and their issue, whether it's physical or psychological, out of context, and you control what, say, for instance, nutrients they're getting, what they're eating, insofar as possible, how much they sleep, and you make more constraints on the other kinds of substances and social interactions that they have. This is totally artificial. You may apply a substance in this artificial environment and say, oh, they responded. Well, yeah, you could say that, but you can't really say how it's going to perform in a natural embedded environment. And we're all individuals. We don't live in little cages. Well, maybe the prison population, but and some people in mental hospitals. But for the most part, we do not live in little cages. We interact with a larger environment, and we have a certain basic nature which interacts with that larger environment. Now, scientific materialism, they try not to discard all those factors, but they rarely succeed in including them. Some of what are known as longitudinal studies, which are studies which cover long periods of time and diverse elements of the population, and these give you a little bit better picture. There's still, you know, statistical studies. And by statistical study, what I'm saying is they are not studies in terms of individuals and the individual's interaction with his or her environment. They are studies of groups. They are studies of conditions. They are not studies of people. But I mean, there are many pros and cons to an empirical approach. And by empirical approach, what I mean is collecting statistics, doing controlled experiments, things like that, doing clinical experiments. The clinic, again, is already an artificial environment. So the value of these studies is somewhat, it can be questioned. Let's put it that way. But if you subscribe to the worldview, the philosophy that's dominant in our society, which is scientific materialism, then that's really the only answer. Anyway, this was part 1. In between this and the next video, I'm going to try and, well, no, not try. I'm going to make up an initial reference sheet on this particular topic and put a link, probably under the second video, although I may come back and put it on this video. I hope this has given you some food for thought, and I urge you to kind of examine how you see the world, because that's what determines what you expect in response, and that's what determines how you figure out how to do things. Okay.